So we have this phrase that maybe we often use, or at least we use it in very specific times in our lives or times in our world. And that phrase is that the sky is falling. And now that phrase, we don't ever usually mean it literally, like the sky is actually going to fall upon us. But it describes the feeling that we all have, where we are tempted to fall into fear and despair because the end is imminent, right? Or the end of the world is near, or the end of our life is near. So we might use that phrase. Now we might think that maybe we don't use it for such big events in our lives, but if you look throughout history, you find that this phrase was actually pretty true in many different times. You go all the way back to 1910, and there was the threat of Halley's Comet crashing into the Earth. And during that time, a lot of people started falling into despair, start to fall into fear, thinking that the sky was actually going to fall upon them. The end was near. So people started getting gas masks, or even, I think there was like a comet pill or something like that, that people were trying to sell during that time. Now, that was many years back, many decades back, almost a century ago. Now we come back to times closer to us. You come all the way down to the Y2K incident. In the year 2000, a lot of people were thrown into fear and into a panic because the thought might be that the economy would completely crash because everything was built on computers at that time, or at least depended on computers. And so the computers were going to crash, and so that meant the end of civilization as we know it. I remember people saying that we're going to be thrown back all the way to the Stone Ages when the year 2000 hit. So people started getting food and water. Our family was a part of that panic as well. I can remember my parents getting some kerosene lamps, some water, and some canned food. And I know we weren't completely fearful because we didn't stockpile for a very long time. We had enough maybe to last us a couple of weeks. And so if it really did happen, we probably were going to be out of luck during that time. But it turns out that the year 2000 was just another year, just an ordinary year. Then 2012 came. There's a famous movie about the year 2012 when the end of the Mayan calendar happened, that there was going to be so many natural disasters happening at a very extreme sort of level that a lot of people were going to perish in that time. But we come to the end of 2012, which years ago, and it was just another year, just like every other year that has passed. So these times came and went, but it's easy to see how people maybe during those times thought that perhaps the sky was falling, that the end was near, the end was imminent. But in those times, I think a question that might come to the forefront of our minds, or maybe it wasn't something that we've thought about before, but it's this: what am I putting my hope in? Is my hope misplaced? Those events seem so far from home, something that may not have affected us very much. However, that mentality that the sky is falling seems to come around every election cycle. There might be a candidate in office, and people might say, if this person stays in office for another year, that's going to mean the end of the world for all of us. It's going to destroy the economy. Or if this other person gets elected and this person gets to stay in, if that person gets elected, that's going to mean the end of the world as we know it. The sky is going to be falling on us. Now, this mentality is especially prevalent in our current culture. Our current culture, there's a lot of racial tension that is going on right now. Especially if any of us live in these sort of centers where a lot of these protests and riots are happening, we might find ourselves falling into fear and into despair because of all this stuff that's happening around us. This virus that's going around, that's plaguing a lot of people in our world and here in the United States, all of us have been affected by it, even if we haven't gotten the virus, haven't contracted the virus. Many of us, our jobs have been sort of in limbo. Right? Maybe some of us have been furloughed. Maybe some of us have been laid off from our jobs. Right? There's a lot of uncertainty there, so we might quickly fall into fear or fall into despair. And our economy is sort of seems like on the edge of a collapse, and so a lot of people have fears there as well. And so maybe those things touch your life in some way, but there could be other things through your life that cause you to think with that mentality that the sky is falling, that the end is near. Maybe it's for the world, or maybe it's for your own personal life. But even in this case, we must ask ourselves that same question that we just asked. Like, where is my hope? What am I putting my hope in? Is my hope misplaced? And now, of course, again, we don't say this phrase literally. Right? It describes this feeling that we have. Right? When we feel like our world is ending or the world is ending. These feelings of fear, these feelings of despair. And now these feelings, it's part of being human. Right? This is an emotion that we have to be overcome with fear, to be overcome with these feelings of despair. But the reality is, the fact is that these emotions don't have to overcome us. These emotions don't have to rule our lives. So again, we have to ask ourselves the question, what am I putting my hope in? Is my hope misplaced? Last week we began talking about a man named Daniel. We find Daniel in a foreign land. He's not in Judah anymore, in the southern kingdom of Israel. He's not in Judah anymore. He is now in a foreign place called Babylon, which is being ruled by a man named King Nebuchadnezzar, who again was a very ruthless king during his time. And so Daniel has been captured, taken away from his home, and brought into this place. Yet what we discovered last week is that because of his resolve, God gave him favor in this new reality of his life. And we see that especially in his ability to interpret dreams. And we'll find out today how important that becomes, because it seems like chapter 1 made a point to say that he has been given this ability to interpret dreams. And so chapter 2 is going to be an opportunity for him to use those gifts that God has given him. But you see, under this new reality, I think it's easy for Daniel, and if we put ourselves in the same situation, I think it's easy for Daniel to fall into fear, to fall into despair because of this new reality he is now placed in. But what we find is that his confidence and his hope is not in human kings. It's definitely not in Nebuchadnezzar. He is not hoping or praying for some other human leader, some other king, or some other human kingdom to come along and destroy Nebuchadnezzar so he can have a better life, or hopefully a better life. What we find is that his confidence and hope is in a kingdom that is not of this world, in a leader that is not of this world. He has put his hope and confidence in God himself. And we know this in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, where here's what Daniel tells us. He says, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever." So despite his circumstances, right, this new reality he has been thrown into, he had confidence and hope about this kingdom to come, this kingdom that was going to be installed by God himself. And so as we read Daniel chapter 2, and we're not going to read all of it, there's a lot of verses in here, so I'll read a portion of it and sort of fill you in on some of the details as we go along. But if we turn to Daniel chapter 2, and we begin, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Then the astrologers answered the king, "May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Once more they replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it." Then the king answered, "I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is only one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans." So again, we're thrown into a real time, a real place with real people. Right? So we're in the second year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, and we know, and it begins with, that Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. And it was thought during that time that when you had a very specific dream, that it was from the gods, right? That the gods were trying to communicate something to you. But in this case, what we see is that it isn't any of these other gods in his time. It's actually God himself, the one true God, the only God, who is the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, is speaking to King Nebuchadnezzar. And he gives him this specific dream. And so like any person in that time, if they had a dream that they could not interpret, they would call upon any astrologers or magicians, and that's what Nebuchadnezzar does. And these were people that had probably completed that 3 year of service, right? So these are people who are his advisors. These are people that are close to him, that he wants them to interpret the dream for him. But Nebuchadnezzar seems like he doesn't quite trust these groups of people, these wise men that he has put under his service, because of the extreme sort of punishment he gives them and the requirements he asks of them. He tells them, like, "I don't want you just to interpret it for me. I want you to tell me what my dream was, and then I want you to interpret it." But these wise men are taken aback. They're thinking, well, no king has ever asked us to do that. Nobody would ever ask you to do that. That sounds pretty ridiculous to do that. But yet, Nebuchadnezzar is firm in his stance and saying, "No, you need to be able to tell me what it was and interpret it for me. And if you can't, there's going to be an extreme punishment for you. However, if you can do both of those things, there's going to be a great reward for you." And so then after that, because he's so furious, because Nebuchadnezzar is so furious, in the verses that follow, he then puts out, not a warrant, but he basically says he's going to execute every wise man in the land. Right? So he's so mad about it, he's just going to go ahead and just wipe them off the face of the earth. But what we find is that Daniel then comes into the story, right, in verses 16 through 19. And here's what it says. It says, "At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time," which is very interesting for him to go and ask for time when all these other wise men did the same thing and Nebuchadnezzar did not oblige. But yet he's obliging here, and then it says, "so that he might interpret the dream for him." Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men in Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And so even though Daniel goes and asks Nebuchadnezzar for more time, he doesn't go and beg for mercy from Nebuchadnezzar. He actually goes and begs for mercy from God, because Daniel knows, and again, his hope and confidence is in God alone, not in human kings. He goes and begs and pleads for mercy from God himself. And because he turns to God, we find that God has favor on him and gives him the interpretation for this dream. So he praises God for this interpretation. And so then Daniel goes back to the king, and we read back in verses 26 through 28. It says, "The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar," so that's his Babylonian name, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about." So again, you would think that Nebuchadnezzar hears that and would already become furious at those words, because that's what the previous wise men told him. But then another great word, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were lying in bed are these." And so he begins to tell Nebuchadnezzar what this dream was, and also interprets this dream for him as well. And so this dream that he has, and it's in these verses that follow, and I recommend that you go back and take a look at it. But this dream, and I'll put up a picture here for you, this dream that he had was of this statue. He had this really tall statue, and so Daniel tells him what it was, but then he goes ahead and interprets it for him as well. And so he tells Nebuchadnezzar, right, that he is the head of gold. That there's going to be then, so you go down to the next piece of this, the breasts and arms of silver, that's going to be representative of another kingdom as well. And then the third kingdom is going to be the belly and thighs of brass or bronze, right? There'll be another kingdom that follows. And then there'll be another kingdom that follows after that, which is the legs of iron. And now all of those are representative of kingdoms that have followed the Babylonian Empire. So in succession to that, you find the Medes and the Persians who come in and take over and conquer the Babylonian people. Then after the Medes and Persians, you find the entry of the Greek Empire. The Greeks come in and take over. And then after that, and if you're familiar with history, you know that the Roman Empire comes into the picture and rules for a significant amount of time. But then there's this final kingdom that's going to come. Right? And many people have different interpretations of what this might be, but it describes these feet and toes of clay. Now, some people think that maybe this is some end times kingdom that's going to come. It's going to be sort of a revived Roman Empire. Other people think that it's just representative of all other kingdoms that come after the last one, the Roman Empire. Some people might include America in there as well. But I think the fact is, the reality is that however we interpret it, what's more important here is what Daniel says in verses 34 through 35. He says, "While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken into pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth." And so this is what's important to Daniel, is that there's going to ultimately be this kingdom, right, that is going to destroy all other kingdoms. And so for Daniel, again, his hope and his confidence was not in human kingdoms and human leaders, right? It was in God himself. And so no matter how we interpret these kingdoms, however we look at Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and if that really applies to things about the end times or the end of the world, I think what's more important is to put our hope and our confidence in God, because God's ultimately, no matter how great or how cruel these kingdoms might be, God is going to come back and he's going to destroy all of them, or destroy whatever is left of them. But then we see the end of this story. In verses 44 through 49, it says, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy." Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor, in order that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So you look at any history book, you read about any of these past events and circumstances that have happened. Even more, you might read or see pictures of people and kingdoms and kings that have come and then are now gone. For many of you, some of you have gone to Egypt. You can find pictures online of these, and you can see all these great pyramids, right? Remnants of a kingdom that once was, these Egyptian people. If you've ever taken a trip to Italy, you might see the Colosseum, which we know is remnants of a kingdom that is long gone, this Roman Empire that is long gone. You'll find other architecture throughout the world, and all of these things are just memories of kingdoms that no longer exist. I mean, you can even go to modern-day Babylon in Iraq, and what you're going to find is you're going to find a lot of ruins and some architecture. But again, these are remnants of a kingdom that once was. And all these kingdoms, they had their glory, they had their majesty, right? They built a lot of really fascinating, fantastic, marvelous things. But these kingdoms are no longer in power. Now, for God's people, and I picked these three kingdoms in particular because these three kingdoms played a specific role in the lives of God's people. All of these kingdoms oppressed God's people in various ways, in very cruel and terrible ways throughout time. You go all the way back to the book of Exodus. Right? In the very first chapter of the book, you find God's people under the oppression of the Egyptians. Right? The Egyptians are working them pretty hard, long hours, all right? And they're working in very brutal conditions. And at one point, they don't even get all the tools and the resources they need to build the things that they're asking them to, but yet the same quota, the same amount of things are being asked of them. But so they oppress them in these very, very terrible and cruel ways. But as we know, that Egyptian empire is no longer. You can come all the way back to the New Testament, and you can find how God's people find themselves under oppression by the Roman Empire, by the Roman government. God's people would think about King Herod during that time. When King Herod had ordered the death of every male child under the age of 2, because he heard of this king of the Jews that was being born in Bethlehem. And so you might imagine that God's people, during the time under the Egyptians, during the time under the Roman Empire, that they would begin to think, or have that same mentality, that the sky is falling. That there's this fear or despair that they're tempted to fall into because of the circumstances that are going on around them. But as we know from the book of Exodus, we know God's people, they were in despair and fear, but they cried out to God for God to deliver them, and God delivers them from that. Even in the New Testament, we know that God's people are under oppression, and they're searching and seeking for, and perhaps even thinking that the sky is falling, the end is near, the end is imminent. But yet they're still searching and seeking for this Messiah to come. And we do know that Jesus does come, right? Maybe not the way that they expected, but he does come into the picture. But in all of those times, that question comes up of what were God's people placing their hope in? Was their hope misplaced? We even come down back to Babylon. It's easy to think, or easy to fall into that same mentality as well, that the sky is falling. So Daniel gives this interpretation of the dream, and God's people, or anybody who's reading this book, or the people that are around Nebuchadnezzar, all these other advisors, these wise men, and maybe some of God's people heard what had gone on here. I think it might be easy to fall into fear, fall into despair. Because they might think to themselves, well, Nebuchadnezzar's pretty ruthless. Nebuchadnezzar is oppressing us, right? He's going to destroy our land. And so there's other kingdoms that are coming, but are they going to be good to us? Are they going to care for us? Or are they going to be even more ruthless? Are they going to be even more terrible than Nebuchadnezzar? Right? Are they going to take us further from our homes? So that mentality was there. Are we going to fall into fear? Are we going to fall into despair? So again, that question comes up again. What am I putting my hope in? Or what are they putting their hope in? Is their hope misplaced? Now we know in the midst of all of that Daniel himself was confident. He was not confident in the kings of this world, the kingdoms of this world, but he was confident in God himself. Again, we read Daniel 2:44, as I read earlier. It says, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever." Now we come to our world. We look at our own world, and especially here in the United States, it's easy to become fearful. It's easy to fall into despair when we look at the climate of our world. Right? We know that it's a highly political culture that we live in. And we know that it's causing a lot more division than anything else. Right? There is no unity. Candidates, from both parties or however many parties there are, come in and they are talking about unity, but yet it's causing more and more division. Right? Division between us and other people around us that maybe we don't know, but also division between us and other people in our own lives. Again, we come back to the whole racial tension that is among us. We know there's a lot of unrest that is happening in our world, and if you live in any of these particular places where a lot of these events are happening, it's easy to fall into fear, to fall into despair. And again, many of us have not gone untouched by this virus, this pandemic that is going around, and the effects of it. Some of us have lost our jobs. Some of us may be on the verge of losing our jobs. Others of us have been furloughed, right? So we're not getting paid, right? We're still on the job, right? We still have a job, but we're not getting paid for anything at this point. And so we might fall into fear or despair because the idea creeps in that we might actually lose our job. So we get to these times and we have to ask ourselves this question again, the same question I think God's people had to ask themselves, the same question we have to ask ourselves, and it's, what am I putting my hope in? Is my hope misplaced? Sadly, one of the things that I think we do, and I think all of us are guilty of this, is that we put too much hope, too much confidence in a human leader. And it almost happens every election cycle, where whatever candidate's in office, we really want them out of office because the next one is going to bring about good, right? And bring about a good economy, a strong economy, or all the things that we want. Or we have the opposite reaction that this person needs to get out of office, or we need to have this person. We can't have these people because they're going to destroy everything that we have built for this country. And so we have all these very different opinions about these human leaders that are trying to become president of the United States or president of whatever nation that we might represent. But I think we put too much confidence, we put too much hope in these human leaders. And I think many times we end up becoming disappointed because we put too much hope and confidence in them, and these people do not fulfill it. They don't bring about the good that they said they were going to bring about. Because the reality is, the fact is that no matter how much human leaders promise us, they cannot match up to what the kingdom of God has promised for this world. And so, what should our hope be placed in? World leaders and all the events in our world are in God's hands. God directs all of human history, everything that we experience, which means in the grand scheme of things that we should not be overcome with fear or despair. And we go back to Daniel, and we know that Daniel avoided despair and misplaced hope in his life. He was close to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he realized how limited Nebuchadnezzar was. That he himself could not interpret the dream. So he didn't have all the wisdom there was to know. Daniel also experienced the frailty and the finitude of Nebuchadnezzar himself. And ultimately, in comparison to God, Nebuchadnezzar was weak. His kingdom was weak in comparison to God. No matter how glorious or majestic Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was, it is no match, cannot be compared to the kingdom of God. Now, thankfully, Daniel's hope was not in human kings, human kingdoms, but in God himself. He tells us in Daniel 2:18, he says, he urged them, so he urged his friends, to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so this dream that needed to be interpreted, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Again, his confidence was in God himself. He didn't go beg Nebuchadnezzar to have mercy on him. He went to God first. So he was confident that his life was in God's hands. He was confident that Nebuchadnezzar was in God's hands. He was confident that whatever the future would hold, whatever the outcome might be, that he was in God's hands. Now we look at our world and we're crying out for change. We need someone to do something about everything that's going on. But there's only one person that can bring about the real change that needs to happen, and that is God himself. There's no doubt that there was a cry from God's people in Babylon. There was a cry, most likely from, at least if we put ourselves in their same shoes, that there was a cry from the people in the New Testament when they're being oppressed by the Roman people. And you can read through other sections of the Bible and you can find various events and circumstances where God's people probably had this mentality that the world was going to come to an end, that the end was imminent. At least if it wasn't for the whole world, it was for themselves as a people. And we turn to Daniel 2, verse 35, and Daniel tells us this: "Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth." So other prophets, speak of God's response to the problems that his people faced. And over again, they speak about this Messiah that is coming. And in the New Testament, God's people were looking for a specific Messiah in their time. They were looking for one, I believe, politically speaking. But yet Jesus comes on the scene, wasn't intending to do that. But he arrives, right, and identifies himself with what Daniel speaks of here, this rock that comes and crushes all these kingdoms that have existing during Daniel's time, have come into play in the world, and any kingdom that may come in the future. He is going to crush them. And here's what Jesus tells us. In Luke 20, verse 17 through 18, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." So Jesus, God in the flesh, comes to earth as the entry of God's kingdom on this earth. Yet this kingdom is not fully brought in. It's not fully realized until Jesus comes back again. So what Jesus is saying here when he talks in Luke 20, he's saying, "I am that rock that is spoken of in Daniel chapter 2. And the people around him would have known that. The Jewish people would have memorized the Old Testament, and so they would have known exactly what Jesus was talking about, what he was hinting at by saying these words in Luke chapter 20. Now, what about this kingdom of God? We read in the last book of the Bible, in Revelation chapters 19 through 20, it speaks about this kingdom that is going to come. And this kingdom is going to be universal. It's going to be a kingdom that's going to rule over all the earth. It's going to be visible. Like we're actually going to be able to see it. Right? It's not going to be a spiritual kingdom. It's going to be a real physical kingdom on this earth. And it's going to be eternal. Right? It's going to go on forever and ever. Now we might think, well, what happens to all the other kingdoms on this earth? Well, Jesus is not going to come here and repurpose various kings and various rulers to other provinces on this earth. He's not going to come take some good aspects of some kingdoms and put them into practice. What we're told in Daniel chapter 2 is that God's kingdom, when it comes, right, he's going to destroy all other kingdoms. He's going to do away with them altogether. But then what does that mean for us? Now, what we're told in Revelation again, Revelation chapter 21, verses 4 through 5. And this is, to me, is one of the greatest verses of the Bible that we read. One of the last words that we find in the Bible. And here's what it says. This is when God's kingdom comes. It says, He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. For the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. Now, it's easy for us to fall into fear and to fall into despair and maybe have some misplaced hope when we look at all the circumstances that are surrounding our lives and our world. But how can we not have hope when we read words like this that tell us of God's kingdom that is coming to this earth? It's going to do away with everything that has gone wrong, all these terrible things that are occurring on the earth. There's going to be no more death, no more pain, no more crying, no more mourning. And I know that that's hard for us to imagine because all those things define everything that's going on in our world right now. And so it's easy for us to think that the sky is falling, that the end is near. But there's hope to be found in these words that John tells us that he hears from Jesus himself about this kingdom to come. And so when we're tempted to despair, tempted to fall into fear, we've got to ask ourselves that very first question that we asked, that I'm sure God's people had to wrestle with themselves. That where am I placing my hope? What am I putting my hope in? And is my hope misplaced? Let's pray. God, thank you so much for this hope that you give us. Thank you that you don't just leave us here to fall into fear, to fall into despair. That you provide a way for us to be in relationship with you, to be able to inherit this kingdom that you are bringing upon this earth. Where we get to be on this earth where there is no more pain, no more death, no more crying, no more mourning. And we can't help but see how that just describes everything about our world right now. And so, Lord, I pray for anybody who is tempted to fear or tempted to despair, that they would ask themselves this question, to think about it honestly. What are we placing our hope in? Are we placing it on ourselves? Are we placing it on human leaders to do something good on this earth? When in fact, the only one who can bring about change in this world is you alone. So I pray that we put our trust in you, because only you who can bring about the true change that is needed in this earth. In Jesus' name, amen.